Welcome to Bible Fiber, where we explore the textures and shades of the biblical tapestry. I'm Shelley Neese, president of the Jerusalem Connection, a Christian organization dedicated to sharing the stories of Israel's people, both ancient and modern. I'm also the author of the book, Bible Fiber, a 52-week study of the 12 minor prophets available on Amazon. We are nearing the end of our year-long Torah reading cycle. Over the last 10 months, we've worked our way through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and now we only have 9 chapters left in Deuteronomy. This week's Torah portion covers Deuteronomy 21:10 to 25:19. It's named Ki Tetze, which translates to when you go out. Of the Torah's 613 commandments, this portion covers 74 of them. This is more commandments than any other weekly reading. The long list of laws jumps from wartime rules to family inheritance to animal rights to marriage laws. A significant percentage of the laws address the upstart nation's public health policies, agricultural standards, and financial guidelines. The sheer volume of laws demonstrates how faith must permeate every aspect of life. Admittedly, plenty of them leave modern readers scratching their heads. Like, what does mixing wool and linen have to do with faithfulness to God? However, some laws clearly call the Israelite nation to a higher ethical order than any other ancient people. Many laws focus on defending people who lack societal power. In Deuteronomy 24, God commands, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin." In the Bible's most violent moments of destruction, the main offense against God is society's oppression of the weak. This pattern appears in the stories of Noah's flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the events preceding the Babylonian exile. God brings his most severe punishments when the outcry of the vulnerable reaches his ears, and he intervenes on their behalf. Every time this divine intervention is dramatic. The Hebrew word used here for cry is kara. It is the same word used in certain Psalms of Ascent, when the pilgrims cry out to God. For example, Psalm 121 says, "In my distress I cry to the Lord that he may answer me." Psalms 131 says, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." Both verses use forms of kara. The concept of the poor, oppressed, or marginalized crying out to God is a major theological theme throughout Scripture, and God promises to hear their cry. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example, the outcries of the weak reach a desperate pitch. The Bible has a more severe word for cry out than kara. It is tza'ak. Nahum Sarna, Hebrew scholar and author of Understanding Genesis, defines the Hebrew tza'ak as the anguished cry of the oppressed, the agonized plea of the victim for help in some great injustice. This is an example of when the English translation undermines the Hebrew text. The word outcry hardly carries the same moral outrage as tza'ak. Anytime the outcry of the vulnerable, the poor, the orphan, the widow, or the foreigner, reaches God's ears, he is compelled to radical action. The prophet Ezekiel explains Sodom's punishment. He says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy." God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah when the outcry against them became too great. In the book of Exodus, an unnamed Pharaoh came to power that did not remember Joseph or the Hebrews' past loyalty. As the Israelite population rapidly grew, the Pharaoh became anxious about national security. He feared the Hebrews would ally with Egypt's enemies in the event of a war. Driven by this paranoia, he enslaved them. He forced the Hebrew people to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses, and he eventually escalated his oppression by ordering the death of their male infants. Exodus records the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. This moment of God's intervention on behalf of his suffering people is the climax of the Torah, the pivot point that the prophets always refer to. Later, when they're living in the land, God will instruct the covenant people to treat the foreigner and vulnerable with compassion, and he will each time remind them to recall their own history of being abused slaves in Egypt. In Deuteronomy, Moses warns them that soon enough they will be the landowners and nation builders. Power will be in their hands, and they must not abuse it. They have to act differently than the Egyptians or other heartless and godless empires. God warns that if they fail to protect the weak among them and the outcries of the poor reach his ears, his anger will blaze forth. The prophetic books cite social injustice as a primary reason for the destruction of Jerusalem and exile to Babylon. The prophets condemn the oppression of the vulnerable just as often as they condemn idolatry. In fact, God rebukes the nation for their lack of justice far more than he rebukes them for ritual or sacrificial failures. Religious ceremonies meant nothing to God if the worshipers were exploiting the poor. Isaiah, ministering in the 8th century BCE, delivered a devastating message to the people. He pronounced, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his cherished garden. He expected justice, but saw bloodshed, righteousness, but heard a cry." The lack of compassion in Judah ultimately provoked God's divine wrath and punishment. God does not demand justice in the abstract. He gave practical ways that the Israelites could care for the poor. Moses promised that if the people followed the laws, the outcry of the vulnerable would cease. According to Deuteronomy 24:19, the Israelites must not overharvest their wheat fields. Instead, they must leave forgotten sheaves for the poor to glean. Deuteronomy 24:20 instructs them not to overpick their olive trees. They must leave the remaining fruit for the hungry to share. Furthermore, Deuteronomy 24:17 commands that a creditor must never take the cloak of a widow in pledge. The creditor must have compassion on her plight. If the nation upholds this standard of justice, the outcry of the poor will not reach the ears of God. God will not be compelled to dramatic action and consequences. Instead, as Deuteronomy promises, the Lord will bless the work of their hands. The Israelites will live and thrive in the land, and all will be well with them. What Deuteronomy 24 is to the Old Testament, James 5 is to the New Testament. More than any other epistle, James focuses heavily on ethical daily conduct and moral discipline. As the brother of Jesus, James drew from the moral core of Jesus' ministry, teaching this new band of believers how to live according to the ethical worldview he heard preached so many times by his brother. In the final chapter of his letter, James issues a severe warning to wealthy landowners. He says, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you." Then he points directly back to the labor laws of Moses. James 5:4 explains exactly why God is angry. He says, "Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." New Testament scholars will debate if these landowners were actually Christians or just affluent outsiders. But James was writing to a church, and he already rebuked the congregation in the 2nd chapter for favoring the rich. It's highly likely that some of these oppressors were part of the local assembly. They claimed to follow Jesus, yet they built their wealth by exploiting vulnerable workers. James was just calling out their hypocrisy when he contrasted their lavish lifestyle with the suffering of the laborers. He said, "You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter." The cries of these harvesters in 1st century Israel are the same outcry we see in the books of Moses. James reminds his readers that God is the Lord of hosts. When the wealthy exploit the poor, the outcry still reaches his ears, and God will intervene. True faith must present tangible justice. And when we do offer compassion, mercy, and justice, Jesus sees it the same as if we had acted compassionately directly to him. I'll let the words of Jesus in this Bible fiber, because no one could say it better. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that you saw a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me. That's it for this week. If you would like to get the study questions that go with the reading, please visit our website at thejerusalemconnection.us. Shabbat Shalom. Am Israel High.